Long before the first shots of the Civil War were fired, a different kind of battle was already raging. It started as this quiet, simmering resistance, but it grew into a full blown, thunderous moral crusade. We're going to dive into the story of how enslaved people, free Black Americans, and their allies, well, they didn't just fight for freedom, they fought for the very soul of America, and ended up pushing the nation right to its breaking point.
So that's the big question, right? How does a fight over what's right and wrong become a literal war? How did this movement to end slavery get so powerful that it actually tore the country in two? That's what we're going to unpack. Now, if you think this story starts with politicians in fancy suits, think again. No, this fight didn't begin in the halls of Congress. It began out in the fields. The very first front line in the war against slavery, that was a battle fought every single day by the enslaved people themselves. And just look at how they fought back. We're talking about everyday resistance. Breaking tools, working slower, pretending to be sick. These weren't just small, petty acts of defiance. No way. This was a form of constant, grinding warfare. Think about it. Breaking a tool wasn't just about catching a breather. It was sabotage. It was a direct hit against the economic engine of slavery. And it sent a powerful message. Complete control over us? That's never, ever going to happen. But the resistance wasn't just physical. It was spiritual, too. Out in the woods, in secret gatherings they called hush harbors, enslaved people created something incredible, what we now call the invisible church. This was their space. They blended Christian ideas with their own African traditions to forge a faith that was all about deliverance. So when they sang a hymn like Go Down Moses, it wasn't just a song. Oh no, it was a roadmap, a coded message about escape. It was literally a spiritual guide to freedom. And let's be clear, the resistance wasn't always quiet. Sometimes it was loud, organized, and absolutely deadly. You had massive events like the German Coast Uprising. We're talking nearly 500 people, the largest revolt in U.S. history. Then you had Nat Turner's Rebellion, which sent these waves of terror across the South. And then there's the Amistad Revolt, which proved you could even win this fight in the Supreme Court. These weren't just one-off events. They were a clear, undeniable message. We will fight to be free, no matter the cost. So, while all these physical battles are being fought on the ground, another war is starting to brew. This one was a war of ideas, an ideological war. And that physical resistance, it was about to get a massive boost from a moral awakening that would turn the fight against slavery into nothing short of a holy crusade. Okay, so what was this? Well, in the early 1800s, this huge religious revival, the Second Great Awakening, just swept across the country. And its core message was, for the time, totally radical. Salvation is available to everyone. That one idea lit a fire under all sorts of reform movements because it forced people to ask a really uncomfortable question. If every single soul is equal in God's eyes, then how on earth can one person own another? All of a sudden, slavery wasn't just a political issue anymore, it was a national sin. And this question, it literally tore the country's biggest churches apart. We're talking about major groups like the Baptists and the Methodists just splitting right down the middle. Up north, you had preachers slamming slavery as a sin from the pulpit. But down south, they were using the exact same Bible to justify it, to defend it. You can just feel the country's moral fabric ripping into. So with this moral battleground set, a whole new kind of leader steps into the spotlight. These weren't generals. They were writers, speakers, and activists. And they knew their most powerful weapon wasn't a sword, it was the pen. It was the power of their words. And they were about to use them to make abolition a force that no one could ignore. First up, you've got William Lloyd Garrison. This guy was a firebrand. Through his newspaper, The Liberator, he basically said, forget all this talk about gradual freedom. For Garrison, slavery was a poison corrupting the nation, and there was only one cure: immediate, unconditional, total abolition. Now. His stance was so uncompromising, it just electrified the movement. He drew a line in the sand and dared people to cross it. And then, of course, there's the great Frederick Douglass. As a man who had actually escaped the horrors of slavery himself, his power was undeniable. It came from his own life story. When he published his autobiography, it was a sensation. For the first time, many Northerners were confronted with the brutal, day-to-day reality of the system. His incredible eloquence, his sheer intellect, it just made the human cost of slavery absolutely impossible to ignore. And we absolutely cannot forget the powerhouse that was Sojourner Truth. Here's another person who had escaped slavery, and she became this incredible voice for both abolition and women's rights. In her famous Ain't I a Woman speech, she just brilliantly wove together the fight against racism and sexism. She was challenging the entire nation, asking if its promise of freedom was for everyone or just some. But here's the thing. For every one of these powerful abolitionist voices, there was an equally powerful voice on the other side, defending slavery. And Southern leaders, well, they weren't just making excuses for it. They were championing it, calling it a positive good, something that was basically ordained by God. This right here shows you the massive, unbridgeable gap between the two sides. I mean, seriously, how can you find a compromise when one side calls it a sin and the other calls it a blessing?
So, by the time we get to the middle of the 1800s, the stage is set. The time for talking, for debate, that's pretty much over. What comes next is a series of events, each one ratcheting up the tension, pushing the nation closer and closer to a point of no return.
And maybe nothing symbolized this growing defiance more than the Underground Railroad. Now, of course, this wasn't a real railroad with tracks and trains. It was this incredible secret network of people and safe houses, a massive act of civil disobedience. It helped thousands of enslaved people escape to freedom, and in doing so, it was directly breaking federal law. And you can bet the South was absolutely furious about it.
And at the heart of this network were heroes, people like Harriet Tubman. I mean, the courage is just staggering. She didn't just escape slavery herself. She went back. Again and again. 19 times she returned to the South, personally guiding more than 300 people to freedom. It just goes to show the incredible risks people were willing to take, not just for themselves, but for complete strangers.
So how did the South respond? With the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And this law, it was a political bombshell, because it didn't just say that slave catchers could operate in the North, it went a step further. It forced regular citizens in free states to help capture fugitive slaves. All of a sudden, if you lived in the North, you couldn't just look away anymore. Slavery wasn't some distant Southern problem. It was right there on your doorstep, and people were outraged.
A perfect example of this is the case of Anthony Burns in Boston. When federal agents showed up to arrest this man, an escaped slave, the city just exploded into riots. This was all the proof people needed. The federal government was willing to use its power to enforce slavery even in a place like Boston, the heart of the abolitionist movement. For a lot of Northerners, this felt like a direct attack on their own freedoms. But maybe the biggest blow against slavery didn't come from a politician or a protester, but from a novelist. Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, it wasn't just a bestseller, it was a cultural phenomenon. It sold an insane number of copies, and for the first time, it brought the emotional reality of slavery, the families being torn apart, the casual cruelty, right into the living rooms of everyday people in the North.
The impact was huge. In the North, reading this book was a moral awakening. It turned people who just kind of felt bad about slavery into active, passionate opponents. But in the South, they saw it as nothing but vicious, biased propaganda. More than any law or any speech, this one novel drew a huge cultural line in the sand. It made the conflict personal. It made it emotional. And that brings us right to the 1850s. You look at the situation. After decades of resistance, these moral crusades, these political fights, the country is just at a complete standstill. The South is digging its heels in, defending slavery more fiercely than ever. And the North is more convinced than ever that it's a moral evil. Any real hope of finding a peaceful way out of this, it was pretty much gone.
And so, after everything, the abolitionist movement had forced the United States to confront one final unavoidable question. Could a nation that was born from the ideal of liberty, could it actually survive being half slave and half free? The answer to that question, as we all know, would be written in blood.